module 2 of Intro to Psychology. Welcome everybody. I hope you enjoyed the video lecture from last week. Today we will continue our discussion and we will focus on brain anatomy, brain function, and brain structure. Now, this is of course an introductory level of this area because the main purpose of studying the brain is to better understand the usual triad, so to understand our emotion, our cognition, and our action or behavior. So the triad that we discussed last week. So the first thing I would like to mention is that there's a lot of philosophy that is involved in psychology as a science, and it should be the case because for every type of science, we need to have a discussion on the epistemology of our method, the study of the study itself, the study of science. But we will leave the philosophy aside for this week because there's a lot to cover in terms of how the brain actually functions. Now, if the question is, why should we study the brain in psychology? The answer should be because the brain represents all the neural underpinnings of all the things we just mentioned. Now, I mentioned that we don't only focus on emotions, on actions, and on memories, on reactions, on cognition, etc., perception, selective attention, etc. We're much more than all of that. We're more than the sum of its parts. And yet, for everything psychological, we could say that we find a neural corresponding mechanism or a process. We'll see the difference between these two terms. So this is the reason why we study the brain in psychology. Now, you might wonder, okay, what does it mean to study the brain? Well, it means to study the system that the brain is a significant, perhaps a central part of. And when we think about that, we usually think of two systems, two body systems that always interact. The endocrine system on one side and the nervous system on the other side. Another way to look at this is to look at hormones for the endocrine system and neurotransmitters for the nervous system. Those two are the siblings systems. And depending on what perspective you want to look at, in medicine or healthcare, we think of 7 and or 11 main bodily systems. There is a lot of debate in terms of which one dominates in a causal, sequential effect, but from the sake of psychology, I would say that as long as we understand how these two systems work, we are in a good shape to understand the rest of our human behavior. All right, so let's begin with the nervous system. Simply because, as we will see, talking about hormones is to some extent talking about the different side of neurotransmitters, almost as if you will look at a coin and you will approach the coin from two different sides, so to speak, okay? So, nervous system is the first thing we will discuss. Now, what do we mean by nervous system? You could say that the term itself is self-explanatory, the system of nerves, of neural function, okay? So, nervous. Oh, this doesn't really work that well. Switch. System, nervous system, okay? Now, I want to mention this, that since we talk about language a lot, the term nerve, okay, nerve, okay, it's a cognate of the term neuron, okay? You remember from week 1, going from Greek to Latin, the sound U is sometimes a transference of the letter V to U. So whether you have nerve with a V or neuron, we're talking about the same area. Not to say that the nerve and neuron are the same thing, but when we talk about nervous system, we talk about both. So what is the nervous system? It's a system that comprises multiple areas, and the best way to start a discussion of nervous system is to divide the system into two main areas. These two main areas are called the central nervous system, and the peripheral nervous system. Now, you don't have to be a neuroscientist to understand that the first term indicates the center of the system, or the central system, the central part of the system, and the second one, the periphery, the outskirts, so to speak, of the system. So in practice, when we think about the central nervous system, we think about the brain and the spinal cord, plus all those areas that link these two, okay? So you can think of the pons, the medulla oblongata, etc. These two terms, let's begin right away. Pons, P-O-N-S, okay? It's Latin for bridge, because that's what it does. It's the bridge, so to speak, between the upper half, so not really half, but the upper parts of the central nervous system, the brain, and the spinal cord. It also wraps around the medulla oblongata, which is the second term that we will encounter many, many times. Or just medulla oblongata, elongated in Latin. Now, if we think about the central nervous system, again, we're thinking about this first and foremost, our brain. And we will have to analyze the brain areas as we briefly did last week, but I think we should dig a little deeper today, because I would like you to remember the most important parts of the system. And another thing that we have to keep in mind is whichever direction we take in order to analyze the nervous system, that will determine how deep we will investigate it. So for instance, we at this level, we're only discussing the difference between what's in the center versus what's on the outskirts. But we could also do analysis from up to down, top to bottom, left and right, inner and outer, and that will determine what type of approach our neuroanatomical knowledge will take. So central nervous system is the first thing that I want to show you. So the central nervous system is itself divided into these three main elements that I just mentioned. So especially the brain, the pons, and the medulla oblongata. And of course, the main reason that we view that as a central nervous system, besides neuroanatomical structures, is because it has to do with the processing, the interpretation, and the sort of information. So it orders what muscles should do, for instance, and kind of makes glands and organs function as well. So brain and spinal cord are the two main parts of the nervous system. It is in itself subdivided into two more subsystems, okay? The somatic nervous system and the autonomic nervous system, okay? Somatic and autonomic. Now, names. The first thing I want to mention here is that you should not think of the somatic nervous system as a somatized nervous system per se. What does soma mean? Soma in Greek, let's go up here, S-O-M-A, in Greek means physical body, okay? We could spend hours of philosophical discussion on it, but that's what the somatic nervous system indicates. Autonomic does not mean automatic, okay? So autonomic, it's not automatic, okay? Or, so to speak, self-moving system. So what do we mean by that? Well, in the somatic nervous system, we think of the control of skeletal muscles, and the autonomic nervous system regulates blood vessels, glands, and internal organs. So autonomic nervous system is the one we will spend most of our classes on, except for the central nervous system. But within the peripheral nervous system, the autonomic nervous system is the one we're going to spend more time on, because the analysis of this system will represent the vast majority of function that we will discuss. So central nervous system, peripheral nervous system, the peripheral nervous system divided into somatic and autonomic. Finally, the last subdivision of the autonomic nervous system will be the division between sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system. So from autonomic, we'll go up here. Hopefully you will fit, sure. Sympathetic. Nervous system. S. And parasympathetic nervous system. Okay? Nervous system. All right. If you could remember this division and subdivision of the nervous system, you are already in a good shape for week 2. Okay, so let's review this before we continue. You have nervous system, okay, the cognate or sibling of the endocrine system. Again, nervous system, neurons, neurotransmitters, nerves, endocrine system, hormones for now. Then within the nervous system, 2 divisions. Central nervous system and peripheral nervous system. Central nervous system, the center, so brain, spinal cord, and the connection, especially pons and medulla oblongata. Peripheral nervous system, as the name implies, is the periphery, itself divided into somatic, I delete it now, and autonomic. Finally, autonomic nervous system, subdivided into sympathetic and parasympathetic. Before we continue, quick way to remember this. Think of parasympathetic as in parachute, okay? Think of the para first, okay? Now, this is thinking in reverse, so to speak, or upside down. So para is this prefix added to sympathetic to describe what the system actually does. In short, you could think of the sympathetic nervous system as a plus or a green light, okay? Let me do a green plus here, okay? And the parasympathetic nervous system as the red light, so a red minus. Now, this is an oversimplification, because keep in mind, but another way to frame that will be that the sympathetic nervous system is the quote-unquote gas pedal of the system, is the booster, is the enhancer, the motivator, so to speak, and the parasympathetic nervous system is the brake, is the slowing down system. Now, this is not entirely true. As we will see, there are certain processes that will require the combination of both sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system. It's not always true that the sympathetic nervous system is the enhancer and the parasympathetic nervous system is the relaxer, so to speak. But that's a good way to frame it. And that's pretty much why I suggest you remember this not true etymology of parasympathetic parachute, because it will slow you down. So let's analyze the word. Now, the first thing you notice here is in both cases, you have sim plus pathetic. And I always love to discuss that in my psychology class because it's extremely fascinating. Now, you should remember the first part from last week's lecture, the SYM, okay, the equivalent of the Latin CUM, which is, so to speak, togetherness, right? So we will analyze that more in depth, but for now, the sympathetic nervous system is the one that allows for the pathetic elements to work in cooperation, togetherness, okay? Now, careful what that means. It means that the emotional, the cognitive, the phenomenological structure of the system will be enhanced by virtue of being coordinated, you could say. So let me make some room here and explain what I mean by that. So sympathetic really means that the pathos, okay, is shared, it's combined, it's togetherness, okay, sympathetic, okay? Now look at the word for a second, and let's see what this could mean if we just transfer that from Greek to Latin. Now keep in mind that the Greek letters follow the Latin ones, or rather, historically speaking, the Latin one follow the Greek letters with an in-between alphabet called the Cyrillic alphabet, which is the alphabet of the Slavs, that kind of represents this in-between. So if you were to force this alphabet on the CYM, okay, in Greek, it will be something like this, okay? Okay, it's not fully Greek because the Cyrillic equivalent will be something like this, okay? Okay, but the Latin equivalent of that is this, C-U-M. So see the similarities? Now in English, sim, sim, and in Latin, cum, cam. What about pathos? Pathos as emotion, feeling, manifestation, epiphany, etc. The same thing could be done for pathos. So let's do it here, okay? Now, for the TH, we could do the thorn, okay? Or we can do this, okay? And then, of course, the S. In the Cyrillic version, this will be pathos, okay? In Latin, this one is P-A-S-S-I-O, passio, okay? So you don't have to remember any of this, but the last analogy I want to make is this. So the sympatho in Greek, all right, is equivalent to the Latin cum passio, okay? So they mean exactly the same thing, all right? Now, in modern English, think about the difference in calling someone sympathetic as opposed to calling someone compassionate. Now, you may wonder, all right, I can see some overlapping understanding of these two words. If you're sympathetic, you should be compassionate, or maybe the opposite. I'm not sure which one is the cause of the other. Maybe if you're compassionate, that's a given that you're also sympathetic. But of course, sympathy and empathy are not necessarily the same thing. So you could also say that from the etymological standpoint, sympathy is the feeling of togetherness, okay, expressing sympathy. And empathy is feeling from within, the relation from within, in pathos, okay? Now, this is interesting because in English, the use of the term is not the same one as the way modern Greek and modern Latin or Italian use the term. If you say simpatico, sympathetic, sympathica, etc., that means more like funny, outgoing. So it's quite different from expressing sympathy. But it's an even bigger difference if you remove these two, okay? You just leave the patho, passio, all right? Now you see how different it is to call someone pathetic as opposed to calling someone passionate. This is fundamental to understand psychology because the sympathetic nervous system, again, it's a stimulating element, but there's always a societal or cultural, historical norm that decides how to interpret that emotion, okay? So we cannot fully escape that anthropological dimension. What does it mean to be emotional? What does it mean to be sympathetic or passionate? What does it mean to be pathetic? So this is just a discussion on how the term from a neuroanatomical standpoint can translate into very practical application in everyday life. All right, what about the parasympathetic nervous system? What is para? Para can be viewed as the beyond the main state of affair, you could say. The best example that I often utilize in my courses is parapsychology or paranormal. What does it mean? Paranormal, that it goes beyond what is perceived at the very least as normal, okay? It goes beyond. And very often paranormal events are interpreted as spiritual, transcendental, mystical, or even esoteric event. Parapsychology, same thing. It's the study of the mind, but mind in a more transcendental element, okay? So in terms of the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system, from the perspective of neuroanatomy, aside from all this fascinating, hopefully to you as well, discussion, think of sympathetic push, parasympathetic pull or break. All right. If we think about all the system in the body, we should think of the building blocks. And of course, if you think about building blocks, you can go all the way back to the double helix, DNA, RNA, etc., chromosomes, karyotype, etc. We will not go that far deep into our analysis, but at the very least, we should think about the cell. Okay, so the cell as the building block of everything for now human. Now we will discuss human beings in juxtaposition to the rest of the animal kingdom, but for now, let's think about humans. So the cell, okay? Cell. Now, cell, as the name implies, is both something that creates, that is created, but also keeps prisoner, as in gives shape and form, okay? It's something that contains information. And you will see that in Greek and Latin, the terms very often are simultaneously meaning. So the equivalent in Greek is anything that contains the core term kuton, okay? Whether it's spelled with a K or the C, doesn't matter, but the term CE, okay, is the core of the term, and the LL, as we'll see, is what you find a lot in the Latin equivalent of the Greek term. Example, from cerebrum to cerebellum, okay? We'll see what that means. So cell. So since cells represent every system, every part of our body, is there anything specific or rather specialized from the perspective of the nervous system? Yes, that's the answer. And the specialized cell for the nervous system, it's called the neuron, okay? The neuron. Neuron. So this will be our friend throughout this semester, the dear old neuron. Now, so how can we view the neuron? Well, it's a signaling mechanism, is the basic element of the nervous system, and it's the nervous unit, you could say, of the system. So let's see how that works. Now, again, a suggestion for you is to study things in sequential diagram. So we'll start from a very, very basic understanding, and we'll keep building on each week. Now, I will use more and more slides and other fancy video editing features. I'm just kidding, but I'm adding more and more material as we go, but the basic will remain intact, hopefully, so that you will always go back to the basic. The basic is the neuron. So if you have the neuron as the primary structure of the nervous system, let's start from seeing how the nervous system works at the level of this cellular structure. So this is our friend, the neuron, okay? This is, of course, oversimplified. It's a sphere, okay? Magnified, needless to say. And this neuron has all this structure, okay? Kind of like antennas, okay? Called dendrites, okay? So this is the cell body, right, of the neuron, cell body, okay? And all of this, okay, are dendrites, dendrites. The term dendrites is connected to the Latin term dens, dentis, which means teeth or tooth, each tooth, right, because it reaches out. Now, in terms of what the dendrites does, we have to think about it as the antenna system to receive signaling element from the other neuron. Now, if those are all there is in the system, then you have all these antenna, but you miss the main elements that connects one neuron to the next. Because of course, you could say that you have one neuron there, you have one neuron here, let's call this neuron B, all right? Right, so this will be neuron A, and this will be neuron B. Okay, and assuming that they're all the same, okay, as we will see, there are multiple ways that the neurons interact with the system, and each way is also represented by a different shape. Example, pyramidal neurons that really are shaped like a pyramid, especially in the cortex to connect the cortical structure to the inner workings of the brain, to the limbic system. So pyramidal neurons are really oblong, so to speak. Okay, so the shape itself also determines the function. It's a big debate in neuroscience in terms of which one causes what. Is it function over structure, or is it structure over function? Is the function that determines the structure, or is the structure itself that allows for a specific function? We shall see how the answers to this question really help neuroscience progress. But anyway, those two neurons are separated at birth, so to speak. So we need to figure out a way to connect them. Now, this will also be part of the quiz, so I want to make sure that I don't go too far in our description. So if this is the basic system, now what could connect the two neurons? Well, something like a cable system, okay, which we will call axon, okay? So this one will be our dear axon. Okay? Right. So for now, let's just assume that this axon, okay, it's a big tubular structure, okay, that connects these two, all right? Imagine it as a straw, okay, straw structure. And this is where the first problem arises. If we think about the nervous system, okay, what constitutes nervous transmission or neurotransmission? What constitutes neurotransmission? Okay, because we're talking about the transmission of information. Okay, what is neurotransmission? So in other words, how is information passed from one neuron to the next? There are a multitude of ways to describe that. And there's always a holistic way to look at it. The nervous system, or more in depth, neurotransmission, is a electrical, chemical, and mechanical system. Okay, all three at once. Now, you might find some disagreements in cognitive neuroscience, in cognitive science to define which one dominates. I tend to be somewhat biased to the central part here, so seeing the system more as a chemical system than either as electrical or mechanical, but it's really the chicken and the egg problem. So you need to find something, okay, that stimulates this neuron to communicate with the next one, okay? So at this stage, we could say that the first element is generally viewed as an electrical stimulus, okay? An action potential, okay? Action, oops, this is the wrong one. Action potential, okay? Again, a lot of information today, do not worry, we'll review this multiple times over the semester, all right? So the action potential is to some extent a spark, okay, that occurs right here in the first loop, okay? Something like that, all right? Action potential, something like this, okay? Spark. And for now, we will not analyze the MHZ, we're not going to analyze the shape itself of the spike, all right? But this spike, okay, of the action potential is actually what will give rise to the nervous transmission, the neurotransmission, the X. So pretend that this is some sort of a switch, okay, that creates, that modulates this action potential, and this action potential then has a wave-like shape, okay? All these waves that will allow the communication to occur and reach the next neuron, okay? Now we're talking about bundles of neurons, not just two, of course, but for everything we experience in life, psychologically speaking, you do have a corresponding mechanism when there is an action potential. Now, this is not everything, of course, but the action potential can be monitored, okay? And it can be monitored by virtue of observing the shape, okay? Similar to what happens to an electrocardiogram, okay? We have an electroencephalogram, monitor the shape of these action potential, these spikes, okay? Monitor the refractory period after each spikes, monitor the electricity level within, okay? And by within, I mean the difference between intracellular and extracellular charge, okay? And then, of course, because we're talking about electricity, we will see that there is a corresponding electrochemical feature that, for lack of a better term, for now, we'll call the sodium-potassium pump, okay? That will allow different charge inside to be modulated by the more or less change in chemical properties of the system itself. Now, something that I'd like to mention right away is that the action potential is not the only way to look at the system, but also from a figurative or symbolic way, you can see that these waves really give you the sense of movement, right? So you have the neuron that stimulates this movement, and this movement goes and on and on and on. Now, you will find a problem here because I mentioned that the axon kind of looks like a straw, okay? Now, I oversimplified things here because it should go all the way there, right? But if you think about it, the action potential works only if the straw is well insulated, just as if you look at a cable or a computer, the computer cable should be insulated well so that the electric charge is not dispersed into the ether and the earth, etc., etc. So it has to be insulated, all right? Now, we do have an insulation system in the nervous system, and let me just make some room here. And this insulation, it's called the myelin sheath. All right, let's pretend you have this big, fat, and I'm not using fat as a derogatory term, but it's exactly what it is, okay? Layer that covers the axon, all right? Okay, and this again is called the myelin, from the Greek term for honey, okay? Sheet, okay? Myelin, probably like spelling this maybe. Myelin sheet. All right, so you have this salt. Nature is wonderful in solving these problems. So you have this full insulation, but now you have another problem as a result of this insulation. The problem is that, as I mentioned earlier, for the action potential to be stimulated and continue, you need to have an exchange of chemical properties, okay? An exchange of chemical cations. Cations are positively charged ions, okay? So cations. And for these to occur, okay, so positively charged ions, right? You need to have pumps, okay? Now, there are a variety of chemicals that we will discuss this semester. I would say that sodium and potassium are the two main ones for now, okay? So just imagine this charge has to go in and out from the axon, okay? So imagine, if I can magnify the size of the axon, that this is what happened. So I am increasing the size of this section here, all right? And this one is the axon, okay? Okay, so it's a section of the axon, okay? This is our dear friend, the axon, okay? And then we have this chemical reaction, electrochemical and mechanical reaction that follows this direction. Okay? All right. But if there is no other added potential, then the system itself will fade away. So you need to have an opening for, simplifying reason. I'm just going to make one single opening on top and the bottom, right? So let's pretend you have a little gate here, with a little lid, okay? Okay, and one on the bottom too. Okay. That opens and closes, okay, to allow these chemical changes to occur. So all these particles, all right, enter and exit the system, all right? Go in and out, all right? And this is what determines the functionality of the actual potential, and ultimately of the neurotransmission. But if everything were to be closed, then this could not occur. So the action, the myelin sheet, okay, that covers the system, okay, has to be interrupted regularly so that you could have these gates open and close. And this is precisely how it looks like. You have all this interruption. This is not to scale, not to self, all right? Okay. Etc. And in each of these intersections, so the portion of the axon that I will highlight in blue here, the open portion of the axon, I'll highlight in blue. Okay. In this section, you will have the ability of the system to, so to speak, refresh itself according to this system here. Now, we'll not dig too deep in the sodium-potassium pump for now. I just want you to know the reason for these changes in electric charge and for this action potential. So at each intersection, you have a boost, okay? So each of these intersections, you have a boost, etc. All right? Now, these interruptions are called nodes of Ranvier, for the scientists that discovered them and described it. Nodes of Ranvier. Now, this is not everything, of course, because you probably have heard of the term synapse or synaptic. And that's exactly what occurs here. I left this somewhat interrupted. Now, what happens is that at the end of this transmission is to transmit something. And what is the thing that transmission transmits? Neurotransmitters. So I will delete all of this for now, and I will dig a little deeper into the last part of the system, which will be the synaptic cleft. So I will magnify this time this area here, okay? Okay, and we'll go down here. Let's pretend it's big oval here. Okay, pretend it's a new window computer. And this is the end of the axon, right? Okay. And this is the receiving part or receptor side, okay? Receptor side. Right? Now, for everything to occur, it's not enough to be delivered with all the action potential here, okay? You need to cross over, and we'll see why the term crossover is so relevant here, and then continue and go to the next step, the next neuron. All right. Now, this is also fundamental, as we will see, because we will understand how this has a relevant application into psychopharmacology, for instance, how each receptor takes on a specific shape to receive those neurotransmitters that we need. But for now, let's just think of this as an example. If you've ever heard of SSRIs in psychotherapy or psychiatry, SSRIs, okay, as antidepressants, the term itself is selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors. And this is where it happens, right here, creating this wall, okay, that prevents what? Certain molecules to go back to have this reuptake, which molecules we're talking about? Serotonin, of course, so that more of those molecules will continue their path and make the person feel a certain way, assuming feeling better, okay, due to serotonin. But we will discuss this much more in depth. That's all I want you to remember that for now. Let me see what else I am missing here from the quiz. All right. Perfect. Myelin sheath, axons. All right. So perfect. Okay. So what's the role of this? Well, the axon transmits information away from one neuron to the next one. So there are multiple ways to interpret that. And I should also add this, that there are two different directions from the brain to the limbs and the other way around, okay? And so you have neuromodulation one way from the central nervous system to the periphery. And then, of course, you need to have the opposite movement for the brain to understand what's happening. Example, if I am to, I'll use this as an excuse because I want to drink some more water. If I'm doing this, at first, I will have one series of information from my brain to the bottle because I want to grab the bottle and I want to be able to do that to the details of all the micromodulation of the system. But also, once I have the bottle, I need to have enough information to go back from my limbs to the brain to understand that, hey, I got it. So you need to have two different directions in terms of away from and back towards the brain. Afferent and afferent neurons, okay? With the A towards this little friend there. So afferent neurons, okay? Where A comes from the Latin ad, okay, with 1D, okay, which means going towards, okay, so accusative form, or afferent neurons, where the E comes from the Latin ex, or away, okay, so two different directions, okay. We'll see this more in depth. But that's, for now, all I want you to remember. All right, we talked about that. We talked about the endocrine system. Alrighty. Alrighty. So, well, one thing they should probably have added, I forgot, is that if you think about the myelin sheath, I mentioned this analogy with any type of straw or insulated cable. Now, size and insulation do matter. So in terms of the speed itself, the neurotransmitter, what determines the overall speed beside the chemical composition? The overall speed is determined by the size. The bigger, of course, the size of the axon, the more swift and smooth and fast the neurotransmission will go, but also the better myelination, the more insulation, the words the axon has, the swifter it gets. And we will see how in certain neurocognitive problems, the slowing down the process has a link with this demyelination, this destruction, partial destruction, dehydration of the myelin sheath itself. So the more insulation, the more myelin sheath, and the bigger the size, the better it is for the neurotransmission itself. It's very intuitive, but I think I should mention. All right, so now we mentioned certain chemicals, neurotransmitters, and this is something that we will cover multiple times over the semester. So perhaps as a little homework, so that instead of just so to speak, passively listening to me. You can do some work on your own. I'll let you to do a little research. It's not something I do all the time, okay? I would never suggest you you search too much on the internet about anything psychological or neurological, because usually what happens is that you will self-diagnose with a variety of horrible labels. Okay, that's usually the case in all branches of medicine, but this will be an exception. I will mention a few neurotransmitters, the most common neurotransmitters that we discuss in psychology. I would like to ask you to search them up and figure out what they do. You will not have to write anything down. It's mostly a new way to stimulate your learning process. I will just mention them here, and we'll encounter them multiple times in the semester. The first one, just because we already mentioned it, is serotonin, okay? Serotonin, okay? The second one is dopamine. Okay. The third one is acetylcholine. Okay. And what else could I add that would be interesting? Maybe adrenaline. Let's do noradrenaline, which is black one too. Noradrenaline. Okay. By the way, noradrenaline or norepinephrine indicate the same thing, and same for adrenaline and epinephrine. But so these four, we'll discuss more like GABA, for instance, in terms of receptors. We will talk about beta endorphins and oxytocin, etc., multiple chemicals. But for now, these four will be really something that I would like you to research briefly, simply what they do. I'm not interested in the chemical composition for now, but just a start for you to do some work at home. And let's start with some acronyms. All right. Now, the first thing that I wanted to mention is that how do we study the brain? Well, we study the brain with certain technologies. Now, I did briefly mention the tripartite definition of science according to Aristotle. If you don't remember that, no problem. I will just mention here one more time. So Aristotle, the Greek philosopher, divided knowledge into episteme, techne, and phronesis. Okay. Now we'll focus mostly on techne. So episteme, epistemology, the scientific method itself, the study, phronesis, prudence, the ethical, bioethical, biomedical ethics part. Techne, as the name implies, the technology. So in terms of brain study, we'll focus on the technology. So few ways to interpret the brain. I will mention the acronym, and yet again, I would like you to do some work at home to verify whether you know what they do, although the acronym itself will give away what they actually do. So let's start from MRI. MRI, okay, and fMRI. Magnetic resonance imaging, right? MRI, and the F stands for functional, okay? Functional. Okay? One of the most advanced, most commonly utilized brain imaging techniques, okay? Now, we do have other technologies, for instance, okay? EEG, electroencephalogram, okay? Now, electro, pretty straightforward from electricity, all right? So you already know what they're studying. Encephalo, from the Greek term for the brain, okay, the cerebrum, encephalon, okay, encephalon, okay. And gram, not to be confused with gram only as in the metric system calculation for weight, okay, or unit for weight, but gram as in sign or symbol, the same term we find in grammar, okay, the definition, the script, the sign, and the unit of what you find in the analysis of the electroencephalogram. Then we have CT scans, okay? CT scans, okay? Chromatomography scans, right here. We do have other technologies, one of which has been popularized in the last decade or so by Dr. Daniel Amen, and that technology is SPECT, single positron emission chromatomography, okay, seen as a CT scan, SPECT, okay? And of course, you have other ways to study the brain that don't just observe what happens, but stimulate what happens. Example, transcranial magnetic stimulation, or TMS. Okay? TMS. Now, this is it for now. We will spend a lot of time on each of this, but an interesting thing that I would like to briefly discuss before we continue is the contribution to the localizational processes in the brain by Dr. Gazzaniga, or Gazzaniga, as we should pronounce his name. And for that, I will recommend you watch a video that we'll post in the link below today to this video, because I want you to see the original work by Dr. Gazzaniga, and it has to do with split brain analysis. Before we do that, and also to conclude this part of the conversation, we'll take one more look at the quiz to make sure that I am actually mentioning everything. All right. And I'm doing this because I know that a lot of you were not able to find a textbook. So so it's good that I mention these things here as part of the lecture, so you don't have any problem completing the quiz. Let's take a look at the brain in general, and it's another diagram, the diagram that I'll do pretty much every week, so bear with me, all right? So that we better understand in practice what all those chemicals, you know, serotonin, dopamine, acetylcholine, etc. do, and even other chemicals, like for instance, if you think about awareness, consciousness, higher functioning, we should think of melatonin, for instance, okay? To melatonin and of course the circadian rhythm, the 24-hour clock, it's so important for brain function. Okay, so all those chemicals play a significant role. So it's somewhat arbitrarily induced to divide chemicals only to neurotransmitters and hormones, etc. Because in the end, the system works in cooperation. It's a holistic system. Okay. So melatonin is not something that you take to fall asleep at night or to relax, or as a supplement. It's a significant impact and role in awareness, consciousness, and brain function in general. All right, so one more diagram for the brain, and then we'll conclude this lecture for today. We will continue next week because this is corresponding to chapter 4 in the textbook. But the brain really takes a long time. So I don't want to have too much all at once. We have 2 weeks to review these materials, so there's really no rush. So I will do this. I will do a brain diagram, kind of oversimplified, but rather than doing a cross-sectional analysis from the side, I will do a three-quarter view of the brain, something like this, so that we can have both hemispheres visible. Okay. Okay. Okay, so let's do this. Let's focus first on main areas of the brain. And again, I mention this all the time. At risk of being boring, it's better to repeat this 8,000 times. So yes, I did mention that last week, no problem, we'll review that. All right, so first and foremost, to keep in mind, we do have two hemispheres. Word first, sphere, pretty straightforward, okay? Sphere, okay? That is a sphere, okay? Tridimensional, round-shaped ball, pretty much a sphere, okay? Now, of course, the brain is technically not a sphere, but for simplifying reason, we'll call it a sphere. Hemi has nothing to do with Dodge Acad engines, okay? For the ones of you that are passionate about muscle cars, me being Italian, I love my sports cars. It has nothing to do with that, not Hemi engine, okay, or a Demon or Hellcat or anything like that. It has to do with health, okay? So Hemi is pretty much the equivalent of semi, okay? Again, not as in a truck, but in the sense of half, okay? So half sphere, hemisphere, we have two, okay? Right and left hemisphere. I'm not sure why they did the right one bigger, possibly because the right is more associated with creativity and drawing. So I decided to do a little bigger here. So we have two hemispheres, and for the whole cerebrum, okay, cerebrum, we are talking about contralateral representation. In other words, my left side of the brain will monitor my right side of the body and vice versa. My right side of the brain will monitor my left side of the body. Now, of course, in the video, it's the other way around, but contralateral means opposite, with the exception of this part here, which is the cerebellum. Remember the LL in Latin plus the ending UM. That in Latin means smaller, cuter. So the cerebellum is like the lesser brain, smaller brain, which is really unfortunate because, as I mentioned multiple times, cerebellum has actually more activity than the rest of the cerebrum, but doesn't get as much attention, unfortunately. So left and right. So from the perspective of this diagram, think of it as I see it here. So this will be the left, and this will be the right. Okay. So we're only going to stay at a very basic level here. So bear with me. The left and right hemisphere work in cooperation. We'll see that there are specific areas that only focus on one or the other area, but for now, we'll just leave it like that. Now, four main lobes to review, divided here. We'll do this. Okay, so this blue area, okay, it's the frontal lobe. Okay, so at this point, I will, where is it? I will erase this sphere. Okay, so again, do it with me, hopefully. Okay, frontal, okay, frontal lobe, okay. Then here you have a fissure, Sylvian fissure, Sylvian fissure, okay, that separates the frontal lobe from the temporal lobe. Okay, so this is the temporal lobe. All right. Okay. Then let me utilize the green again for the parietal lobe. Okay, so right here, parietal lobe. And finally, I'll have light as leftover color. Okay. Right here, the occipital lobe. Okay. All right. Now, I do have another lecture that goes a little more in depth about this one, but since we're going to cover this next week, there's no need to go too deep here. So for now, let's think of the frontal lobe and the parietal lobe as the two opposite sides of what? The central sulcus, which is this area here. Okay, that divides the somatosensory from the motor cortex of the brain. Okay, and it's called central sulcus because it's first of all at the center, right here on its side. Okay, and try this at home. Okay, and really goes all the way around. So this one is the central sulcus. Okay, so as usual, if you see a brain, if you ever had a chance to see a brain, the two things that will always help you find your way around the brain are the cilium fissure on the side and the central sulcus on the top. So if I can go closer, maybe here, you see what I'm talking about. So this is the right hemisphere. This is the cilium fissure right here, and this is the central sulcus right here. Okay, so 1 and 2. So this will separate the frontal lobe and the parietal lobe from the temporal right here. Okay, so frontal and parietal, and the central sulcus will separate the frontal lobe from the parietal in the back. Okay, and this in green is the cerebellum, of course. So this is what I would like to conclude with. Maybe just a few more things. There are things that only occur on the left side, okay? And one of those things in the left side have to do with language, all right? So for now, again, you don't have to memorize this at all, but it's a good way to begin the conversation. Think of it this way. If the frontal lobe has to do with rationality, reaction, emotion, calculation, planning, right? And the temporal lobe has to do with some level of sensory understanding, okay? Even intuitively, you have your ears right here, okay? Some level of hearing, okay? Then you will conclude that certain areas that are at the intersection between the frontal lobe and the temporal lobe will have to do with speech, okay? And here's another fascinating thing about the brain or the system, that in general, what's inside the brain develops first, and what's on the outside of the brain develops last. So what's inside the limbic system will develop first. What's on the outside, the cortex, the bark, will develop last. Not just that, but as I mentioned, the frontal lobe, specifically the prefrontal cortex, is the very last thing to develop, okay? Which makes sense because the prefrontal cortex will also have to do with some level of rational veto power. And since it's not fully developed until we are late adolescents, it's not surprising that a lot of us, when we were teenagers, did a lot of silly stuff, okay? Because we don't have that veto power, this rational power to plan ahead just as much, okay, as an adult would do. And that's precisely why it develops later. Not only that, but beside the inner-outer change, the other thing is top-bottom difference, okay? So what's on the top is in general higher functioning, and what's on the bottom is more like life preservation. And we'll see that when we talk about brainstem, and then medulla and pons, okay? As opposed to cortical function. Finally, the other thing is what's in front versus what's in the back. What's in front in general has to do with reaching out, with movement, with aggression in the etymological sense, okay? People always confuse this. Being aggressive from a neurobiological perspective, as well as from a etymological perspective, means to reach out. Aggression, okay? Aggression comes from the Latin ad gredior, okay? To reach out, to grasp. Now, of course, one could grasp with a violent intent, but grasping itself is reaching out. So what's in front of the system tends to be outward, reaching out. What's in the back of the system is more like understanding, bringing in. And right here, we have an explanation of that. So in front, okay, you have the aggression, the movement, the motor cortex, okay? So in front of the central sulcus, motor cortex, okay? In front, okay, see where the eyes are, in front, right here. Okay? In the back, corresponding, you will have what? The, right here, somato, from the body, right? Soma, remember, sensory cortex, okay? We'll see how that works next time. But for now, in front, motor, in the back, somatosensory. For language, very similar. You have broadcast area right here. BROCA, broadcast area, okay? The neuroscientist, okay? And in the back, right here, where is that? Right here, you have, where should I write it? See, does it fit if I write it here? Right here. Wernicke, or Wernicke, if you want to pronounce it in German. Okay? Both relate to language, but as you imagine, if you say language plus motor, front, right? Versus language versus sensory back, the result is that broadcast areas, which is in front on the left hemisphere, will be responsible for speech production because he activates muscles, right? Reaching out, movement. And Wernicke, which is in the back, has to do with language comprehension. This is fascinating when we talk about strokes. We'll have a chance to discuss that more in depth. Good way to remember, think of alphabet. B is first, so in the front, the alphabet, well, Latin alphabet at least, okay? W is after, and so it's in the back, okay? Now, this doesn't necessarily apply with the Cyrillic alphabet, okay? But at least for our sake, that's pretty much it. Think of it as the application of brain knowledge to the amelioration of understanding of ourselves. That is what psychology does. If this is the case, one of the most important things that you will study as part of this course is neurogenesis and neuroplasticity. These two terms are, at this point, popular parlance or conversation. Neuroplasticity, and neurogenesis, okay? Genesis, okay? All right. And it had to do with the nervous system, obviously, okay? From two different angles. From the perspective of neuroplasticity, the fact that the system is plastic, okay? Not plastic as in the material itself, but flexible, plastic as in malleable, flexible. So this is something I'm going to tell you right away, and we'll repeat it throughout the semester. Doesn't matter what you went through in life, all the challenges, all the desperation and suffering that occur to you, you always need to keep this in mind. Everything has the potential to change. Yes, we all carry a burden deep inside of us, but the fact that we have the ability to change accordingly to the surrounding element, which means both the environment, our friends, our families, and our own choice, makes the system more prone to react appropriately. So do not worry. Whatever happened to you, you can decide to bring forth if it's useful, if it's nurturing, if it's good, or leave it behind if it's no longer serving its purpose, okay? We can not forget everything necessarily, but we can put things in perspective, and that's what the brain allows it for. As I mentioned, we'll not talk about philosophy in this lecture. We just stick to data, to empirical knowledge, but that's what neuroplasticity indicates. The fact that the brain changes depending on how you use it. So example, this course, okay, or any course, please do not label yourself as, I don't know, lazy or dumb or stupid or any of that. Because yes, there is some innate talent in the way we learn things, but everything else is just practice, practice, practice. There's no such thing as I'm bad at math or I'm bad at psychology. Sure, you want to not start at the same level as another person, But the more work you put into it, the more the brain will perceive that as, guess what? Fun. So the more you do that, the better you're going to get at it. Okay, so something that I mention from time to time. It's a kind of a metaphor. So there's a person that attempts to play piano, and the person never played piano before, and a person comes next to them and says, oh, please, give it up, you're not good. And the other person will reply, well, if I will give up, of course I will never be good. That's precisely why I practice, okay? So keep practicing. Neurogenesis is the ability of neurons to be born again, not in a theological sense, but in a physical sense. And this is something that's been fascinating because, especially when we think about Parkinson or Alzheimer or other neurocognitive degenerative diseases, for many decades, scientists believed that all the cells in the body were able to reproduce, but neurons were kind of an exception. Once you lose them, that's kind of it. There was no turning back. Now we know that for neurons as well, they have the capacity to be reborn, regrow again. Now there is a difference between the pruning elements in neuroplasticity itself. So in other words, how axons and connection are born again, or they're malleable and they're recreated, as opposed to the neuron cell itself. But those two terms, nevertheless, are a significant part of what we do here, because it's precisely what we do in psychology. A part of psychology in the context of psychotherapy to help people is the assumption, which is entirely predicated on scientific evidence, the assumption that things can change, because otherwise we will just lie to our clients or our patients, or ourselves. If nothing can change and you're doomed to re-experience all the suffering and the mistakes in the past, why bother? Well, the truth is that you should bother, because things do change and you will improve. So thank you very much for your attention to this lecture. Next time we'll continue with part 2 of our brain knowledge. Hopefully you enjoyed, and I will see you all next week. Bye-bye.